Psychologists of Reddit. What are some of the creepiest mental conditions you've ever encountered? Story 1. I was in a psych ward for depression, and my roommate was terrifying. She was schizophrenic, depressed, and was probably just weird. She punched herself in the face constantly while whispering to the voices in her head. She also used to sit in the multi-purpose room, TV, games, fridge, etc., on the floor and play with herself, like, a lot, but she never stopped whispering to herself while she did it. I woke up one night, and she was just in her bed, staring blankly at me. She was moved to a long-term facility on my 3rd day there. Oh god, I had a similar experience with my roommate. He was this really big guy, very nice and well-mannered. He would tell us and the doctors during group therapy about how his mother didn't care about him. He told sob stories like many people there did, and it was sad, but not unusual. Then one day, one of the doctors mentioned something about a certain medication he was taking, and I recognized it was an antipsychotic. It turns out he was a paranoid schizophrenic, and it just terrified me when I put the pieces together. And then I overheard his mother sobbing as she left from a hospital visit, and his father trying to calm her down and reassure her that he doesn't know what he's saying and it isn't his fault. Story 2. Not a professional, but a friend of mine is suffering from the Capgras delusion. We moved apart several years ago and hadn't been in touch very well. I knew she had gone through some stressful times. I had a couple of phone calls with her where she was worried that her computer had been hacked, but she seemed reasonable. Then one day she called me and told me that her husband had been replaced with an imposter. She wanted me to fly to visit her so I could see him with my own eyes and confirm for her that it wasn't really him. Talking to her is simultaneously fascinating, unnerving, and heartbreaking. The worst part is, while she's clearly not correct in her beliefs, she is quite consistent in them, and they are utterly real in her mind. Imagine how terrified you would be all the time if you were certain that the most important person in your life was a stranger with mysterious, nefarious motivations. Imagine going to bed every night next to someone you thought was out to get you. Imagine spending all day desperately trying to find your husband because he must be out there somewhere, right? Story 3. A lot of people know about phantom limb syndrome, in which someone continues to feel as if their limb is there even after it has been amputated, often in great pain. Another interesting one that not many people know about is almost kind of the opposite, is body integrity identity disorder, which is when a person has extremely strong feelings that one or more of their limbs does not belong to them, despite being functional, and often they really want to amputate. From their descriptions, it seems like it is actually very psychologically painful, sometimes to the point that they will self-amputate because no doctor is willing to amputate a healthy limb. Story 4. Reactivate attachment disorder. I worked at a group home for kids with this disorder, and it was creepy before I fully understood it. Children who have suffered severe abuse and neglect early on in life often have their ability to form healthy attachments to caregivers or anyone destroyed. Some of them would cling to me, call me mommy, and beg to come home with me 30 seconds after I met them. Others would refuse to talk to anyone, hurt themselves and others, set fires and act out any chance they could. Sometimes they would improve enough to be sent to foster homes only to have their behavior come back worse once they were placed in an unstructured family setting. It's extremely tragic because there is basically no hope of a cure and they will have the disorder for the rest of their lives. Story 5. Fatal familial insomnia is pretty frickin' scary. Suddenly, you just start not being able to fall asleep, and you're gone within 7 to 36 months. You gradually lose the ability, along with a number of other symptoms over time, until it eventually, at the end of the last stage, you'll have not slept in a long time, will have been hallucinating and suffering from dementia, and eventually die. Only 40 families, about 100 people, have the disorder. Also, if you have it, there's a good chance you'll have kids by its onset, making the disorder pass down even further. Scary stuff. Story 6. Split brain syndrome. Sometimes, as a mean of treating severe seizures/epilepsy, surgeons will sever the corpus callosum, the connecting tissue between the two lobes of the brain. The good news is that future full-blown seizures are limited to one half of the brain, leaving the patient aware and able to take precautionary measures. The bad news is that, thanks to the lateralization of function, there are essentially two minds in the skull that can each only react to certain forms of stimuli. Patients usually develop workarounds, though. The weirdest part is the occasional outcome of alien hand syndrome, in which one of the brains takes control of one hand and uses it independently. When questions are presented to the controlling hemisphere, the hand can write out its answers, which are sometimes in disagreement with the main brain and the patient's spoken answers. Story 7. I'm a psych major, so not a professional, but in my opinion it is catatonic schizophrenia. Those suffering from this type of schizophrenia, although in the DSM-V they are getting rid of the different types of schizophrenia, there will just be one classification. Will sometimes be unable to speak or move. My professor worked in a clinic while in school and told us of one patient who would suddenly lock up in extremely awkward positions and would not move for extended periods of time. Story 8. I'm a psychology major, but this story does not have to do with my schooling. To put myself through school, I work as a receptionist at a swimming pool, and Thursday is the day when individuals with disabilities and mental disorders come to the pool with their workers. I was on the other side of the counter helping the individuals into the change rooms, and one of the clients grabbed my hair and started screaming at me that it was too beautiful and she needed to take it. One of the single most upsetting moments of my life, because after her worker managed to get her to relinquish my hair, she continued to just scream wordlessly until I was no longer in her sight. Story 9. Wife is a psychologist. She says shared delusion disorder. Woman and her mother had paranoid delusions about mom's ex-husband and were convinced he was stalking them and breaking into their house. The ex had gotten the woman's son, aged 6, a modeling contract, and they thought that every picture of a kid in a magazine was him. The images that didn't look like him they claimed were photoshopped. This was so weird and creepy since two people shared the same delusions. Story 10. Psychologist here. Works specifically with kids with degenerative/developmental disorders. And in my day I have seen some shit. There is nothing creepier than something called happy puppet syndrome, aka Angelman syndrome. It's a disease most commonly found in children where they always have a happy effect, even when hurt or sad. And top it all off, their gross motor skills are affected in such a way that their limbs move as if they're on marionette strings. Story 11. I was once at a party and joined this group of people, of which I knew just one person. He introduced me to the others one by one, and when I arrived at the last one, Noah, I shook his hand and petted his shoulder. He grabbed my arm and flipped it around and almost snapped it. Needless to say, it was the most awkward situation in my life, and even thinking about it makes me cringe my teeth. I learned then Noah had been in Afghanistan, and he freaked out when something or someone touched him from his back. Story 12. My favorite is dissociative fugue. It's incredibly rare. Essentially what happens is one day, your mind goes blank and you move. Once you've reached a location, you start building a new life for yourself, new name and everything. If questioned about your old life, you either get very upset or brush it off, and when asked about your past as a member of your new life, you have nothing to say. Eventually, after months or years, your mind snaps again and you return home to relive your original life, unaware it happened. It's usually brought on through stressful trauma. Story 13. When I was in a mental hospital, depression plus suicidal thoughts, there was this woman there, probably early mid-20s, I guess. She seemed kind of stable, if a little quiet and distant most of that time. But then you would see her curled up in the corner somewhere, clutching a pillow tightly against her chest, rocking back and forth, singing nursery rhymes to this pillow. Sometimes, when she didn't have the pillow or something else to hold on to, she would freak out and start screaming that someone had stolen her baby. Even if they gave her a pillow or something to hold on to, she would keep freaking out and they'd have to sedate her. I also once saw her trying to feed the pillow. Story 14. I'm a psychology major, and the weirdest stories come from my professors who often studied sociopaths and psychopaths in prison. This one guy was a sociopath and started early. When he was 7 years old, he had a puppy that he loved very much. An older neighbor of his accidentally ran over the puppy with his truck. The boy was very angry, so he went to the top of an overpass with a cement block as the man with the truck drove under. The boy pushed the cement block over the edge and it fell, smashed through the windshield, and killed the old man instantly. He never felt any remorse for it and even chuckled at how silly he was as a little boy. Story 15. My dad was a psych tech working the night shift for years and had some pretty freaky stories. 1. There was a guy who couldn't have a window because he would howl at the moon every night and tear up the room. 2. When he was in the monitoring room reading something and he heard a noise, he set the book down and looked at the hall. Nothing was there. He went back to reading and a few seconds later heard it again. He stood up and looked down the hall. Nothing was there. The third time he heard it, he lowered his book, looked up, and probably had a heart attack. A patient was standing probably 5 feet away, looking like something out of The Exorcist, and just staring daggers at him. Story 16. I worked with a guy who had Prader-Willi, hungry all the time, no judgment of feeling full, and pica. Eats non-food items like cigarette butts, cotton in pillows, socks, dirt, etc. As you can imagine, anyone who was hungry all the time would be f***ing huge. He was. The first time I took him out, we got to the car and drove to the lakefront with no problem. We got up to a restaurant door and past a giant ashtray. There was nothing I could do. He ate 2 to 3 fistfuls full before I could get him to stop. Story 17. Psych major. It's been said before, but antisocial personality and psychopaths/sociopaths. Basically, anything where a person doesn't have empathy or a moral compass scares the crap out of me. People like that. They can be taught what is and isn't moral or socially acceptable. They can be taught logic, but they cannot be appealed to on any emotional or empathetic level. The idea of someone being able to hurt or kill someone else without feeling bad about it terrifies me more than anything else. I guess because I don't see a way you could really stop them to give them a reason to stop. Story 18. Alien hand syndrome. If the hemispheres of the brain are separated, it can sometimes result in one hand constantly acting as though possessed. If you're driving, it'll try to run you off the road. If you're opening a door, it'll slam it back shut. Like your own personal thing, except it hates you. Story 19. I remember when I did my 200 HR practium at a mental health center, we were told at our induction about this normalization. It's like you go through moments of feeling like patients inside the facility, and people outside are just the same, and all situations are normal. And apparently this is the reason why mental hospital staff need to take mandatory leaves. Story 20. I've always found associative visual agnosia interesting. You maintain the ability to see objects and the intelligence to know what an object is, but your brain is unable to make the connection between an object's features and its identity. In one case study, a guy gained the ability to draw objects with excellent accuracy. They gave him a key, and he reproduced it perfectly in sketches. When asked to identify the object, he could tell you about its features, metallic, some sharp edges, but he couldn't tell you what it was. Doctor: what if I told you it was a key? Patient: oh, that would make sense. I bet it is a key. He could list the features that matched with a key. Doctor: but what if I told you it wasn't a key? Patient: oh, well, I guess you're right. It probably isn't a key. Story 21. I am diagnosed with undifferentiated schizophrenia. I have periods with auditory hallucinations, mostly unintelligible whispers, no orders or commands, and they're not derogatory most often. What scares me the most is the fact that I know something is wrong and I can't trust my hearing sense. I have to question all sounds, voices, or other to try and figure out if it's real or not, even in the periods where I'm not hearing anything. How can I be sure if it's real or not? It might be the onset of a period. Story 22. I visited a friend in a private psych ward once, and they showed me into his room, and I couldn't see him, but could hear him snoring. Turns out he was sleeping under his bed because the doctors kept dancing and singing around his bed like crazy clowns, and he couldn't sleep. He said horror movies were the worst because he would look in the mirror and see the monster. Poor guy. Story 23. I work on a mental health helpline, and what I find the strangest is the specifics of people's delusions. For example, the other week I spoke to a woman who believed that if she stopped reading the Bible, then Satan would end her children, which was a particular issue at the time as she needed a shower and her favorite cookery program was on. After talking this through with her, we came up with the idea of her downloading the audiobook and having it playing in the background so she could get on with her evening without the fear of repercussions. Story 24. Hemispatial neglect or left side neglect. It usually happens when people have a stroke in certain places of their brain, and they will just ignore stuff on one side, typically their left side. Sometimes it can be so bad they won't even eat food on the left side of their plate, even if they're really hungry. It's not that they don't see it, it's just that their brain doesn't process that there is anything important on their left side. If you ask them why they neglect stuff on the left side, they'll often make up excuses. For example, my professor in college said he did a study where he asked people with this disorder to copy a picture he presented, a simple drawing of a house and a tree or something. The patient didn't draw the left side of the house. When the researcher asked her why, she said, "I didn't like that side very much, so I didn't draw it." Story 25. I'm a psych social worker with much experience working at a state inpatient psychiatric hospital. I've seen everything. Seriously. I have seen everything in the DSM. Honestly, the ones that are the creepiest will always be sociopaths. There's nothing like them. Far creepier to me than psychotics, antisocial PD is creepy as Story 26. The best one I could come up with was paranoia, the persistent belief that there are people out there who have taken extreme interest in your life and are trying to help you. I'm still waiting for someone with positive schizophrenia, a person with the stereotypical voices in the head, but they're reassuring and calming. You're doing the right thing. You're a strong person and can do anything. Since I've specialized in experimental psych, however, I have a few personal experiences that I can relate. Rehabilitation counselor here. I have a client who has aspects of positive schizophrenia. Some her people are friends. Story 27. I don't know what it is, but I should get help for this. Every time I see someone from far away, it often looks like someone I know. I'll be walking through a completely different city where no one I know would be, and all of a sudden I'll say, "Look, there's my mom," or "Look, there's my sister." It's super weird. I really believe it until they get close. Sometimes I have to stop myself from yelling out to them, and in some cases when I am alone, I have. I usually check with my girlfriend before I attempt to confront anyone to say hi because she most often says they aren't anyone I know. Super strange and scary when I walk alone. Has led to me blowing people off because when I do see them, I tell myself it can't be them, so I don't say anything until they do. Story 28. Clive Waring completely lost his short-term memory. Every time he saw his wife, he thought it was the first time he saw her in like 10 years. He couldn't hold a conversation because by the time he was halfway through a sentence, he forgot what the hell he was talking about. Yet he could still play piano to a very high level. Must be horrific. He described it as living in a dream world. Story 29. Going into the psychology field. When I was younger, my mother was always freaked out about everything. She always talked about how someone was going to find her, they were out to get her, etc. She would check every lock, close every blind, and often stay up all night guarding the house. I rarely left the house. She wouldn't let me have friends, really. I lived in constant fear of these people. She made me paranoid. She had paranoid schizophrenia the whole time. All of those people, delusions, imagination. It was creepy for me to realize that the things I had been made to fear my entire childhood were nothing but the monsters in my mother's mind. Of course, it was compounded by a few other mental disorders, but the schizophrenia was the one that really stood out to me the most. Story 30. My friend's mom went off her meds and started telling me that Nicolas Cage was trying to take over the government. She used the term "jolly ol' Saint Nick" to justify it before trying to attack me with a stick. I work in a group home for autism, OCD, and a number of other mental illnesses, and I have for 5 years, and the strangest episodes I've ever seen. Story 31. Worked in primary schools with disengaged young people, mainly boys 10 to 13. Saw similar to what many describe here, Sith trauma-based disorders, including a couple of extremely creepy kids. You got the feeling that no matter how much support they got, they would still assassinate someone eventually.